Hi, I'm Michael Mayer from VocalWisdom.com, and in this video I'm going to talk about open throat. This is a very common concept. Most people recognize it as being important, as being necessary, but there tends to be some confusion, I think, in what it actually means. I think if you would ask a singer, should the throat be open, most people would recognize that the answer is yes, but if then you ask them what that means, you might get a lot of different answers. And so I want to talk just for a couple minutes here about what open throat means to me, what I think it should mean to singers in understanding this concept more effectively, so that they really get the proper benefit of thinking about this. Now, maybe the most common way of thinking of an open throat is something related to a yawn, and so we get a lot of this sort of yawning, yawning, yawn, sighing. This is a common, and this actually was very heavily promoted by the teacher William Vennard. He was very famous. He wrote a very influential book, and a lot of teachers picked up on that. Very common tool, the yawn sigh, this feeling of, now there's some benefit to that in the sense of releasing if somebody has a tendency, and a lot of people do, including at a certain point. I had this tendency. I think a lot of developing singers, young singers do, because have this tendency of squeezing the throat, or at least having the throat space being too small. And I think it's because of our talking habits. We don't talk with the whole potential of the instrument. So most of our time is spent in some level or some degree of being more closed than is ideal for our vocal instrument. And that's the thing that can be helpful to guide us, is to remember we're trying to be a musical instrument. And so one of the principles of a musical instrument is a good resonating system. And for us, that resonating system is made up of the airway, the vocal tract, which is essentially the airway that runs from the larynx up through the throat, into the mouth, and into the nasal chamber. So the most common association with an open throat is yawning. What happens when we yawn? We open, but what ends up happening, you can hear how my voice gets distorted when I yawn, because there's something happening in the tongue that sort of makes it retract or pull back. And this distorts the pronunciation, and it sort of blocks the resonance. So even though it feels open in the oropharynx, the space that's directly behind the mouth, it's kind of blocking off the high and the low. We have to remember the pharynx is made up of 3 levels. The oropharynx is the middle. The top level is the nasopharynx, and the lower level is the laryngopharynx. And we need to have all 3 appropriately opened. And we don't want to distort in any way by opening one part a lot to the detriment of the other 2 parts, or even 2 parts to the detriment of 1 part. So for me, an open throat is first a completely released, unconstricted airway. And how's the best way to do that? Through breathing. Not through yawning, through stretching, not even through stretching, through breathing, and training ourselves to release any habitual holding that might exist in there. When we talk, we have the tendency to pronounce very forward in the mouth. Even like this, you can maybe tell, I'm very forward in the mouth, but in order to create that placement of the experience of the words, everything else has to close down. So we really want to take the pronunciation from the front of the mouth, where everything's kind of closed down like we do when we talk, and release that open. You hear how there's a little bit of a sleepy quality to the voice when I speak in that condition. It's not the same as yawning. Yawning is like that. Yawning is beyond that, and it distorts. But if I release, it's a little bit sleepy, but it's not distorted. You can still hear the words have pretty good clarity, pretty good accuracy, and not distorted like when I yawn. Okay? So that's the first step, is just to breathe and release the habitual holding. A really helpful tool I've found over the years is to swallow and release. If we're interested in an open throat, take a minute and think about what's a closed throat. One is the constriction that I talked about with our talking, but the most closed throat is a swallow. The whole purpose of the larynx in our anatomy is to protect the lungs when we eat and drink. So when we swallow the food and liquid, the larynx comes way up and closes off that part of the throat, closes the airway off so the food can kind of get squeezed down behind it and go down to the stomach. So if we think about what's a closed throat, what's the most closed condition of the throat, the swallow, then we can kind of make the logical connection that what we want is the opposite of a swallow. So using a swallow to kind of wake up our sensation to that condition is really helpful. So by swallowing and then releasing, see, when the swallow releases, the larynx drops back down and then the pharynx reopens. So we can swallow and then encourage ourselves to kind of maximize that release. Swallow. And then if we inhale at the same time too, that encourages even more release. And you can hear how it opens up back here. The larynx drops down a little bit. We can breathe that even more so that the larynx, maybe even you can see this. The larynx drops, stretching the jaw a little bit to let the larynx go even a little bit farther. And then still feeling the ability to breathe through the nose and smell. And now the top is open, the bottom is open. Ah, ah. And there's then the vibration in the larynx happens, which is the bottom of the throat. Our breathing reflex happens to feed that vibration because we want to say something. And then with all that nice and balanced and steady, the throat stays open. When the larynx isn't stable and isn't participating in the vocalization, and we're only using the breath, ha, ha, the larynx is going to rise. The larynx never, for some reason, the larynx never drops when it's unstable. It always rises when it's unstable. And so, ha, we're going to shorten the vocal tract. We're going to reduce the amount of potential we have for resonance, and we're going to become, we have a higher possibility of getting uncomfortable or developing fatigue, because the larynx also vibrates differently. So that's a topic for a different video. But so open throat, think of it as an open airway. It's open not just this way, but it's open this way, right? So not constricting it, but releasing it. Feel the sense of breathing all the way through from the nose, nasal passages, behind the mouth, and down through the bottom of the throat. The larynx itself feels released, and like an empty box, and you can breathe right through it, right down into the chest, into the lungs. And then you don't change anything. Don't let that close when you start vocalizing. Once you start to phonate, you need to keep the feeling of the openness. So that can act as a resonator. Okay? So I hope that makes sense and gives you a little bit of an idea of what I think an open throat is. All right? We'll see you again soon. Thanks.